Dr. Emily Hartley stepped off the small, rusted seaplane, her boots sinking into the soft, damp soil of the Amazonian jungle. The oppressive heat and humidity wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, but Emily barely noticed. Her mind was consumed with the thrill of discovery. As one of the leading parasitologists in her field, she had dedicated her entire life to finding and studying rare parasitic organisms. This expedition had the potential to be her greatest triumph. She glanced around at the thick canopy of trees, the tangled vines, and the distant calls of wildlife echoing in the humid air. Her team, composed of local guides and fellow researchers, began unloading equipment from the plane, but Emily's attention was elsewhere. She didn't care much for the logistics or the exhausting trek ahead. She was here for one reason: the parasite. For months, Emily had been following rumors of strange infections deep in the rainforest, stories told by villagers of an organism that didn't just feed off its host, but integrated itself into the very fabric of their being, transforming them from the inside out. Most of her colleagues dismissed the accounts as folklore, but Emily had learned long ago that there was often truth behind such tales. As the team began setting up camp, Clara, Emily's young lab assistant, approached her with a worried look. "Dr. Hartley, do you think we should be more cautious? I've been reading reports these infections, they sound different, dangerous." Emily barely looked at her, waving the concern away. "Of course they're dangerous, that's why we're here. If we can study it, we can understand it, and if we understand it, we can control it." Clara frowned, but said nothing further. She had grown used to Emily's single-minded focus, even if it unnerved her sometimes. 2 days into the expedition, the team found what they were looking for. Deep in the heart of the jungle, nestled in the crook of an ancient tree, lay the remains of a large animal, a jaguar, its body riddled with strange black tendrils that had burrowed into its flesh. The stench of decay hung thick in the air, but the tendrils were still moving, writhing as if they had a life of their own. "Here," Emily whispered, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "This is it." She moved closer, slipping on her gloves and kneeling next to the body. As she examined the tendrils, her heartbeat quickened. These weren't just parasitic organisms, they were something else entirely, something more. The tendrils seemed to pulse, as though they were alive and aware. "Dr. Hartley, we should wait," Clara said from behind her. "This doesn't feel right." Ignoring her assistant, Emily carefully cut a sample of the tendrils and placed it into a sealed vial. She could feel the excitement coursing through her veins. If she could study this organism, the possibilities were endless. A new species, a breakthrough in parasitology, and potentially even medical applications. The kind of discovery that could redefine her career. "Get this back to the lab," Emily ordered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through her. "We need to analyze it immediately." As night fell and the team returned to camp, Emily couldn't shake the exhilaration. The parasite was different. Unlike anything she had ever seen, she had no intention of wasting time. After dinner, while the others rested, she began running tests on the sample she'd collected. Hours passed as Emily studied the organism under the microscope. The way it moved, the way it reacted to stimuli, it was almost as if it were intelligent, responding to her every probe and prod. She felt a strange pull toward it, an urge to understand it more deeply. That was when the accident happened. Reaching for another slide, Emily's gloved hand slipped, and the vial containing the parasite sample tumbled from the table, shattering on the floor. Instinctively, she bent down to clean it up, but in her haste, she grazed her exposed wrist against one of the tendrils. She froze. A sharp, stinging pain radiated from the point of contact as the tendril burrowed into her skin. Emily yanked her hand back, but it was too late. The organism had already infiltrated her bloodstream. She stared in horror as the tendril disappeared beneath her skin, leaving only a faint, pulsing line where it had entered. For a moment, panic gripped her, but then, a strange calm washed over her, like a wave settling after a storm. The pain subsided, replaced by an odd sensation and awareness of her surroundings that felt heightened, as if her senses had been dialed up. She could hear the soft rustle of leaves outside the tent, the distant buzz of insects, even the faint sound of Clara's breathing from the other side of camp. Emily's mind raced. She should be terrified. She should call for help, but instead, she found herself fascinated by the experience. The parasite hadn't harmed her. If anything, it seemed to be enhancing her. She flexed her fingers, feeling stronger, more attuned to the world around her. Quickly, Emily pulled down her sleeve to cover the pulsing line on her wrist. She couldn't let the others see what had happened, not yet. Not until she understood what the parasite was doing to her. For the next few hours, Emily sat alone in her tent, her mind spinning with the possibilities. Whatever this organism was, it had chosen her. She could feel it deep inside her. Something was shifting. It wasn't just feeding on her like any ordinary parasite. It was bonding with her, becoming part of her. And for the first time in her life, Emily Hartley felt truly powerful. The morning after her encounter with the parasite, Emily awoke in her tent with a strange sense of clarity. The events of the previous night played out in her mind, the shattered vial, the organism burrowing into her skin, but the fear she had expected never came. Instead, she felt energized, her body humming with a vitality she had never experienced before. Outside the tent, the camp was already stirring. The sounds of her team, preparing for another day of research, filtered through the thin canvas walls. For a moment, Emily considered confiding in Clara about what had happened. But a nagging voice in the back of her mind, something deeper, more primal, warned her to keep it to herself. She stepped outside, the warmth of the Amazon sun hitting her face. Her senses felt heightened, the jungle alive with sounds she had never noticed before. The distant hum of insects, the rustle of leaves in the trees, even the subtle shift of wind across the canopy, it all seemed clearer, as if she had become attuned to the rhythm of the forest. Her body felt stronger too, more agile. "Dr. Hartley," Clara called, walking toward her with a clipboard in hand. "I've gone over the data we collected yesterday. The organism structure is..." Clara's words faded as Emily's attention was drawn elsewhere. She could feel something, a pulse of awareness, as though the jungle itself was alive in a way she had. "Emily?" Clara asked, concerned by her distracted look. "I'm fine," Emily replied quickly, snapping back to the present. "Just thinking about..." Clara gave a hesitant nod, sensing something different about her boss but unsure what to make of it. She glanced at the clipboard again. "I was going to suggest we take some extra precautions, especially after seeing the state of that jaguar. The parasite's effects on its host." "It won't be a problem," Emily interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "We've handled worse before." Clara opened her mouth to say more, but decided against it, choosing instead to drop the subject. Emily's focus returned to the camp around her. As the day wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her was changing. The heightened senses weren't just her imagination, there was more. She was faster, more aware of her surroundings in ways that bordered on the supernatural. By midday, Emily began to experience strange flashes, fleeting images and thoughts that weren't her own. As she passed by one of the research tents, she felt a sudden jolt of fear, but it wasn't hers. She glanced around, trying to locate the source, only to find one of the guides, a local named Santiago, standing nearby, talking to another team member. His face was calm, but Emily could sense the tension beneath the surface. He was nervous, afraid of something, perhaps of being so far from civilization, surrounded by the unknown dangers of the jungle. Before she could think about it too much, the sensation vanished, leaving her slightly disoriented. "Emily, you okay?" asked Marcus, the head of logistics, as he walked by, concerned by her distant stare. "I'm fine," she repeated, but her voice wavered. She hurried into her tent, her mind racing. Back inside, she examined the pulsing line on her wrist where the parasite had entered. It was faint but still visible, a dark thread beneath her skin. A wave of unease rolled over her. This wasn't just a parasite feeding on her body. It was emerging with her, bonding. As the hours passed, the strange flashes became more frequent. Whenever Emily passed someone feeling anxious or afraid, she could sense it, taste it, almost as if the parasite inside her was feeding on the emotions of others. It became clear that it wasn't drawing strength from her fear, but from the fear of those around her. By evening, Emily's concern turned to fascination. She sat alone in her tent, staring at her wrist and flexing her hand, feeling the latent power pulsing beneath the surface. The parasite wasn't a threat, it was a gift. It was enhancing her, giving her abilities she could have never imagined. She felt stronger, more focused, her reflexes were sharper, her mind quicker. And the connection to fear, it wasn't just a tool for the parasite, it could be a tool for her as well. But there was a cost. When Emily ventured out of her tent that night, walking silently among her sleeping team, she noticed something disturbing. Santiago, the guide she had sensed fear from earlier, was tossing and turning in his sleep, murmuring anxiously. His face was twisted in a grimace, as if trapped in a nightmare. Emily moved closer, her curiosity getting the better of her. As she neared, she felt it again, the pulse of fear radiating from him. But this time, something inside her responded instinctively. The parasite, sensing the fear, stirred, and Emily felt a surge of power. Santiago's fear was being drawn into her, feeding the organism within her. She stepped back, horrified at what was happening, but it was too late. Santiago let out a strangled cry, his body convulsing before going still. Emily froze, watching as his breathing returned to normal, but his face remained locked in a tense, fearful expression. She had taken something from him, something vital. His fear had strengthened the parasite, and in turn, it had strengthened her. Emily stumbled back to her tent, her mind racing. She had to understand what was happening, to figure out how to control it. She couldn't let this power consume her, or worse, consume those around her. But a darker part of her, the part now bonded with the parasite, whispered otherwise. This power could be harnessed, controlled. And the more fear it consumed, the stronger they both would become. The realization terrified her, but at the same time, it exhilarated her. She could feel the parasite inside her, urging her forward, pushing her towards something greater. As she lay in her cot that night, Emily felt the connection between her and the parasite deepen. It wasn't just inside her, it was becoming part of her, a symbiotic relationship that would change her forever. And in the stillness of the jungle night, as the sounds of the rainforest faded into the background, Emily hardly smiled. Emily's life had taken on an unsettling new normal. Days passed since her encounter with the parasite, and though she tried to maintain her composure, she knew things had changed. The subtle hum of life around her, the heightened awareness of the jungle, and most disturbingly, the way fear now clung to the people around her like an aura, it all pressed in on her mind. And with each passing day, the organism within her seemed to grow stronger. As the team prepared for another day of research, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not by anyone around her, but by the presence inside her, ever alert, always listening. It was more than a parasite now. It was a companion, whispering thoughts and suggestions, filling her with a sense of superiority. She felt powerful, more powerful than ever before. But with that power came the cost. That afternoon, Clara confronted her. "Emily," Clara said softly as they stood by the riverbank, the murky water flowing sluggishly under the jungle heat. "You've been different lately, distant. I'm worried about you." Emily's heart thudded in her chest, but not from guilt or concern. Instead, she felt a wave of irritation. How dare Clara question her? Couldn't she see how much Emily had sacrificed? How close she was to an unprecedented discovery? "I'm fine, Clara," Emily said, her voice low and clipped. "You need to stop worrying about me and focus on your work." Clara hesitated, clearly torn between concern and fear. Emily could sense it, like a faint vibration in the air. The parasite stirred inside her, drawn to the fear radiating from Clara. Emily tried to push it back, to control the sensation, but it surged forward, as if feeding off Clara's uncertainty. "I've seen things," Clara continued, her voice trembling. "In the lab, the way you've been acting. And the samples, there's something off, Emily. I think we should stop." The words struck Emily like a slap to the face. Stop? Stop now. When she was on the verge of something extraordinary, she turned toward Clara, eyes narrowing, and felt the parasite lurch within her, pushing her to react, to silence Clara's fears in the only way it knew how. For a fleeting moment, Emily considered it. The thought of lashing out at Clara, of shutting her up permanently, crossed her mind, unbidden. The parasite urged her forward, its hunger for fear twisting her thoughts. But Emily resisted. "Not yet, not Clara. You don't understand what you're talking about," Emily snapped, forcing herself to regain control. "We're closer to a breakthrough than you can imagine. If you don't want to be part of it, maybe you should leave." Clara flinched, clearly hurt. Emily could sense the fear rising in her, and she had to fight against the parasite's growing desire to feed. Clara turned away, shaking her head as she walked back toward the camp. Emily stood there for a long time, staring after her, a bitter taste in her mouth. Later that evening, Emily stood in front of the lab tent, unable to shake the growing sense of unease. The parasite was becoming harder to control. Every time she felt someone's fear, whether it was a team member's concern or the distant anxiety of the jungle animals, it surged to the surface, hungering for more. And worse, it wasn't just reacting to the fear, it was starting to create it. As the night deepened, Emily found herself alone in the lab, poring over the data from the organism. The parasite was changing her at a molecular level, bonding with her cells, enhancing her physically and mentally. But there was something else, a dark side effect. The parasite's connection to fear wasn't just passive. It was actively encouraging fear, manipulating situations to produce the very thing it fed on. Emily's hands shook as she went over the data. What had she unleashed? Before she could process it further, the tent flap opened, and Clara stormed in, eyes blazing with determination. "I know what you've been hiding," Clara said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I saw the data. I saw the way you reacted to Santiago. You killed him, didn't you? This thing inside you, it's dangerous. We need to get you help." Emily froze, her heart pounding. Clara had discovered too much. She knew, and she was afraid. The parasite reacted instantly, feeding off the palpable terror radiating from Clara. Emily tried to resist, but the hunger was too strong. A wave of power surged through her, clouding her judgment, filling her with a dark, twisted sense of control. "I don't need help," Emily said, her voice unnervingly calm. "You don't understand what this is, Clara, what it can do, what it can make me." Clara took a step back, panic flashing in her eyes. "You're not yourself anymore, Emily. You're letting it take over." For a split second, Emily saw herself through Clara's eyes, unhinged, dangerous, consumed by something far beyond her control. But the moment passed, and the parasite's influence tightened its grip on her mind. Before she could stop herself, Emily lunged at Clara. Her hand struck Clara's throat, slamming her against the metal table with a sickening thud. Clara gasped, her hands clawing at Emily's arm, trying to free herself. But Emily was stronger now, impossibly strong. The parasite surged within her, feeding on Clara's terror, reveling in the chaos it was creating. Clara's eyes widened, her voice barely a whisper. "Emily, please." In that moment, something inside Emily broke. She released Clara, watching in horror as her assistant crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath. The parasite howled inside her mind, angry at being denied its meal, but Emily forced it back with every ounce of willpower she had left. She backed away, trembling, as Clara lay on the floor, her body limp but alive. Emily fled into the night, stumbling through the jungle, her mind racing. What had she done? The organism wasn't just enhancing her, it was controlling her, turning her into something monstrous. She could feel it now, deep inside, twisting her thoughts, her desires. Every time she tried to resist, the parasite grew stronger, feeding on the fear she was trying to avoid. Panting, Emily collapsed by the river, the sound of rushing water drowning out the pounding in her ears. She stared down at her reflection, watching as her face twisted into something unrecognizable. The parasite's influence had seeped into every corner of her being, transforming her from the inside out. Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of what she had become hit her. She had killed, she had hurt Clara, and the worst part? A small, insidious part of her didn't regret it. The parasite had made her feel powerful, invincible. And for the first time in her life, she had felt free from the limitations of fear, of doubt. But that freedom came with a price. As she sat there, staring into the dark waters, Emily knew she was running out of time. The parasite was too strong now. If she didn't find a way to stop it, it would consume her completely. And when that happened, no one around her would be safe. The night in the jungle was oppressive, a thick, suffocating heat that weighed down on Emily as she sat by the river, staring at her reflection in the dark water. Her mind buzzed with the horrors of what she had done, what the parasite had driven her to do. The memory of Clara, gasping for breath on the lab floor, was burned into her consciousness. But even more disturbing was the deep, unsettling realization that she had enjoyed the power, the control. It terrified her, but she couldn't deny it. Emily splashed cold water on her face, trying to shake off the intrusive thoughts. She needed to regain control, to fight back before the organism took over completely. But every time she tried to think clearly, to formulate a plan, the parasite inside her pulsed, clouding her mind with whispers of strength, dominance, and invincibility. A rustling sound from behind startled her. She turned quickly, her senses still heightened, alert to every movement. In the shadows of the jungle, Santiago stepped forward, his face drawn and haunted. His sudden appearance sent a wave of confusion through Emily's mind. Santiago had been the first to show signs of the parasite's influence, yet he had survived barely. But something was wrong with him. He moved slowly, his expression blank, as though he was a shell of his former self. Emily. His voice was a hoarse whisper, distant and mechanical. The parasite inside her stirred in recognition. Emily could feel it a connection, a shared bond with the organism inside Santiago. He, too, had been infected, but the parasite had consumed him more completely. He was no longer a man, but a puppet, controlled by the very thing that now lived inside Emily. "Please, help me," Santiago's voice wavered, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw a flicker of the man he once was, a desperate plea for release. But the parasite quashed that glimmer of humanity, and his body jerked forward, as if pulled by invisible strings. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She had to get away, to warn the others. But then the parasite in her pulsed again, pushing her forward, luring her towards Santiago. A twisted curiosity bloomed within her. What would happen if they merged fully? What new heights of power could they reach together? As Santiago drew closer, Emily fought to regain control. Her mind was a battlefield, a constant push and pull between her will and the parasite's. She could sense its hunger, its desire to feed on fear and domination, but she wasn't ready to give in. Not yet, no, she muttered through gritted teeth, forcing her body to stay still as Santiago reached out with trembling hands. Suddenly, a shout pierced the air. Clara emerged from the jungle, breathless and clutching a flashlight. Her eyes widened in horror at the sight of Santiago and Emily standing in the moonlit clearing. "Get away from him, Emily," Clara shouted, her voice trembling with fear. The moment Clara's fear spiked, Emily felt it, sharp and potent. The parasite inside her reacted instantly, surging forward with hunger. Emily's muscles tensed as she struggled to keep it under control, her mind splitting between the desire to help Clara and the dark urge to consume her fear. Clara rushed toward Emily, ignoring the danger. "We have to go. We need to find help before this thing takes over." For a brief moment, Emily's resolve wavered. Clara was right. She couldn't let the parasite win. But as Santiago staggered forward, eyes glazed, the parasite's pull intensified. Emily could feel its whispers, promising her ultimate control if she simply gave in, if she accepted what she had become. "I can't," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's too late." The confrontation came to a head as Santiago lunged at Clara. In the chaos of the moment, Emily acted without thinking. She grabbed Santiago by the arm, her strength now inhuman, and threw him to the ground with a force that shocked even her. Santiago's body hit the dirt with a sickening thud, his breath ragged as he struggled to rise. Clara stared at Emily in stunned silence. "What are you doing?" But Emily wasn't listening. The parasite was in control now, coursing through her like wildfire. She felt powerful, unstoppable. Santiago lay at her feet, a victim of the same infection that coursed through her veins, and she could feel the connection between them, as if the organism inside them both was calling out, begging to merge. And then it happened. With one final pulse, Emily let go. The parasite surged forward, seizing control completely. Her vision darkened as she felt herself slipping away, the organism overriding her thoughts, her emotions. She was no longer just Emily Hartley, scientist and explorer. She was something more, something far greater. The parasite bonded with Santiago's organism, their shared infection intertwining. Emily could feel it, like a current of energy crackling between them. Santiago's eyes glazed over as the last remnants of his humanity faded away, replaced by the collective consciousness of the parasite. And in that moment, Emily understood. The organism didn't just feed on fear, it thrived on it. It spread through the terror it created, growing stronger with every life it touched, every mind it broke. And now, it had found its perfect host in Emily. Emily turned to Clara, her expression unreadable. Clara stepped back, terror in her eyes. "Emily, don't do this. You can fight it, I know you can." But Emily's mind was no longer her own. The parasite's influence had become too strong. Clara's fear radiated from her in waves, and Emily could taste it, feel it seeping into her very core. The organism inside her reveled in the sensation, urging her to take what it wanted to consume Clara's fear, to grow stronger. For a moment, Emily hesitated. Somewhere, deep inside her, The real Emily still existed, buried beneath layers of control. She could hear Clara's voice, pleading with her, begging her to fight. But the parasite's voice was louder, more persuasive. It whispered promises of power, of freedom from weakness. Clara stood frozen, watching as Emily's face twisted in agony, caught between the last vestiges of her humanity and the overwhelming force of the parasite. Then, with one final, agonizing breath, Emily made her choice. Emily lunged at Clara, faster than humanly possible. Clara screamed and darted to the side, narrowly avoiding Emily's grasp. Desperation fueled Clara's actions as she sprinted through the dense jungle, the trees a blur around her. Behind her, Emily followed, relentless, silent. Every movement was precise, as if the jungle itself parted for her, obeying the will of the organism that controlled her. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear Emily's footsteps closing in, the sound growing louder with every passing second. She stumbled over roots and vines, branches slashing at her arms and legs, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The parasite inside Emily was hunting her, feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every terrified breath Clara took. But Clara wasn't ready to give up. As she ran, she spotted the flickering light of the campfire ahead, the outlines of tents barely visible in the darkness. There was still a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. If she could reach the others, maybe they could stop Emily. Maybe they could find a way to fight back. Clara burst into the clearing, gasping for air, her clothes torn and blooded. "Help! Someone help me!" The team members at the campfire turned toward her, their expressions a mix of confusion and alarm. Before any of them could react, Emily appeared at the edge of the clearing, her eyes dark and empty, her body brimming with the parasite's power. The jungle fell deathly silent as Emily stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Clara. Clara's heart sank as she realized the awful truth. The Emily Hartley she had known, the brilliant, determined scientist, was gone. In her place stood something far more dangerous, something unstoppable. And Clara knew, deep down, that there was no escaping it now. The camp was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension as Emily stepped into the clearing. The jungle, usually alive with the sounds of insects and nocturnal creatures, had fallen silent. The only sound that remained was the crackling of the campfire, its faint glow casting long, distorted shadows across the terrified faces of the team members. Clara stood at the center, her chest heaving with exhaustion, her eyes wide with fear. The others had rushed to her side, confused by her sudden appearance, but now their attention had shifted to Emily. They could all sense at the wrongness emanating from her, the unnatural aura of something far beyond human. The parasite had fully taken control, and Emily was no longer the woman they once knew. Emily, one of the team members, Dr. Morales, ventured cautiously. He took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "What's going on? What happened to Santiago? Where's the rest of the team?" Emily's gaze flicked at him briefly, her expression cold and emotionless. Inside, the parasite pulsed with hunger. She could feel the fear in the camp rising, thickening the air with its intensity. It craved more. The parasite wanted to consume it, to spread its influence to every person present. "Emily, answer me," Dr. Morales insisted, his voice tinged with panic now. But Emily didn't respond. The parasite was in full control, and all it cared about was its next move, how to best feed on the fear that radiated from the others. Emily could feel it calculating, strategizing. The organism was far more intelligent than she had originally thought. It wasn't just a mindless parasite, it was a predator, and it was toying with its prey. Clara stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Please, Emily, you don't have to do this. I know you're still in there. Fight it. You can still stop this." For a brief moment, Emily's expression faltered. Deep inside, a small fragment of her true self fought against the overwhelming control of the organism. She could hear Clara's words, feel the desperation in her plea. A part of her wanted to stop, to resist the parasite's pull, to return to who she once was, but the parasite was too strong. It had taken root too deeply, and it had no intention of relinquishing its control. The team realized the danger too late. Before anyone could react, Emily moved. She was a blur of motion, faster than any human should be. Dr. Morales barely had time to register the attack before Emily's hand struck his chest, knocking him to the ground with bone-crushing force. He gasped for breath, his eyes wide with shock. as the parasite within Emily fed on the fear that now consumed him. Panic erupted in the camp. The other researchers scattered, some running for their lives, others frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer horror of what they were witnessing. Clara, however, stood her ground, tears streaming down her face as she watched Emily, her friend, her colleague, become something monstrous. "Stop!" Clara screamed, her voice breaking with anguish. "Please, Emily, stop!" But Emily didn't stop. She turned toward another team member, a young intern named Javier, who had backed himself into a corner, his face pale with terror. Emily's gaze locked onto him, and the parasite inside her swelled with anticipation, craving the fear that now filled the air. Javier's breath came in ragged gasps, and he stumbled over his own feet as Emily approached. "No, no, please," he begged, his voice trembling. Emily hesitated. For a fraction of a second, she felt something stir within her, an echo of who she used to be. She could see the raw terror in Javier's eyes, the helplessness in his posture, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced through the parasite's control. But then the parasite pushed back, stronger than ever. It had no room for mercy. Fear was its fuel, and it would stop at nothing to consume every last drop of it. Emily lunged toward Javier. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. The sharp crack echoed through the jungle, startling Emily and causing her to pause. She turned her head sharply, searching for the source. Clara stood several feet away, holding one of the expedition's flare guns, her hands shaking, but her expression resolute. "Emily," Clara said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her, "this isn't you. I don't know how much of you is left in there, but I won't let this thing destroy you. I won't let it win." For the first time since the parasite had taken over, Emily felt a surge of something unfamiliar pain. The flare gun hadn't hit her, but the shock of the sound, the sight of Clara standing against her, jolted something deep inside her. The parasite roared in anger, trying to drown out the flicker of humanity that was struggling to re-emerge. Clara took a step closer, her eyes locked on Emily's. "I know you're still in there, Emily. Fight it. You have to fight it." Emily's body trembled, her mind a battleground between the parasite's influence and her own fading consciousness. She could feel the parasite tightening its grip, trying to crush the last remnants of her will. But Clara's words were like a beacon, pulling her back from the brink. The organism pulsed angrily, flooding her senses with images of power, control, and dominance. It whispered that she didn't need to fight, that she was stronger with it, that she was meant to be more than human. But then Emily remembered. She remembered the faces of her team members, their trust in her, their camaraderie. She remembered the thrill of discovery, the love of science and exploration that had driven her to the Amazon in the first place. And she remembered Clara, her friend, the one person who had stood by her through everything. Emily gasped, clutching her head as the parasite fought back, trying to smother the memories. But she wouldn't let it win, not this time. With a final surge of willpower, Emily forced the parasite back. She screamed in agony, her body convulsing as she wrestled control from the organism. It thrashed inside her, desperate to maintain its hold, but Emily was stronger now. She had found something the parasite couldn't touch, something more powerful than fear, hope. Clara watched in awe as Emily fell to her knees, trembling, her face contorted in pain. The others had gathered nearby, unsure whether to approach or run, but Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. "Emily," Clara whispered, kneeling beside her. Emily lifted her head, her eyes no longer glazed with darkness. They were filled with pain, exhaustion, but they were her eyes again. She took a shuddering breath, her voice weak but steady. It's still in me," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "But I can control it. I think I can stop it." Clara's breath hitched. "How? What can we do?" Emily's gaze shifted to the fire pit, where the embers glowed faintly in the darkness. She knew what had to be done. The parasite was still inside her, still feeding on her fear. But if she could sever its connection, if she could destroy the source, there might be a chance. "I have to burn it out," Emily said, her voice firm despite the terror clawing at her insides. "The organism, it's inside me. It's connected to me. If I destroy my body..." "No," Clara cried, grabbing Emily's arm. "There has to be another way. We can find a cure. We can." "There isn't time," Emily said, her voice gentle but resolute. "If I don't do this, it will spread. It will take all of you. I can't let that happen." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she knew Emily was right. The organism was too dangerous, too powerful to contain. If it escaped the jungle, it would devastate everything in its path. With a heavy heart, Clara nodded, her voice breaking. "I'll stay with you." Emily smiled weakly, her hand squeezing Clara's in gratitude. "Thank you." Together, they approached the fire. Emily stood before the flames, her body trembling as the parasite writhed inside her, sensing its impending doom. The others watched in silence, too afraid to intervene, but too awed to look away. Emily looked back at Clara one last time. Tell the world what we found here. But make sure it never happens again." Clara nodded, her tears streaming freely now. "I will, I promise." With that, Emily stepped into the fire. The flames roared to life, engulfing her body in a searing inferno. Emily's scream echoed through the jungle, a sound of both agony and release as the parasite inside her was incinerated. The others watched in stunned silence, the fire blazing brightly against the dark night. As the flames consumed her, Emily felt the organism's hold weakening, its influence finally fading away, and in her final moments, she was free. The camp was silent, save for the crackling of the dying fire. The flames had receded to glowing embers, the brightness of the inferno dimming with Emily's sacrifice. Clara stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the remnants of the fire, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The weight of everything, the discovery, the terror, the loss settled heavily in the pit of her stomach. Emily was gone. Around her, the other survivors were beginning to gather, their faces pale, their eyes filled with a mix of shock and confusion. They had witnessed something beyond human understanding, something none of them could have predicted when they first set foot in the jungle. And now, the one person who had been their leader, their anchor, had given her life to stop it. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to steady herself. She had to think, had to figure out the next step. They were still deep in the Amazon, miles from civilization, with no clear way of contacting the outside world. But more than that, she knew they weren't safe, not yet. The parasite was gone from Emily's body, destroyed in the fire, but they had no idea how far its influence had spread. Santiago had been infected, and so had Emily. What if others in the group had been exposed? What if the organism had already taken root in more of them? Clara couldn't bear the thought that they might have come this far, only to face another outbreak. Clara called the team together. They gathered around the remains of the fire, their expressions wary and uncertain. The air was thick with tension, the unspoken fear hanging over them like a dark cloud. "We need to get out of here," Clara said, her voice hoarse from the strain of the past few hours. "Now, we don't know if anyone else has been infected, and we can't risk staying in the jungle any longer." Dr. Morales, who had survived Emily's earlier attack, nodded in agreement, his face drawn and tired. "But how do we know who's been exposed? What if it's already too late?" Clara shook her head, refusing to entertain the possibility. "We don't know that, but we have to assume the parasite hasn't spread. Emily destroyed it when she, her voice faltered for a moment, the weight of Emily's death catching in her throat. She took a deep breath and forced herself to continue. She stopped it, but we can't take any chances. We need to leave and quarantine ourselves until we know for sure." Javier, the young intern, looked at Clara with wide, fearful eyes. "What if we're already infected? What if it's inside one of us right now?" Clara's heart pounded at the question, the same fear gnawing at her mind. She didn't have an answer. The thought of the parasite lurking inside one of them, waiting to emerge, was terrifying. But she knew panic would only make things worse. "We'll have to watch each other closely," Clara said, her voice steady despite her fear. "If anyone shows signs of infection, heightened aggression, erratic behavior, we isolate them immediately. But for now, we stick together and focus on getting out of here." The group murmured their agreement, though it was clear that none of them felt safe. Clara could see it in their eyes, the fear, the uncertainty. They were all on edge, wondering if the parasite was still among them, hiding in plain sight. As the team prepared to leave the camp, Clara took a moment to gather her thoughts. She stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out into the dense jungle that surrounded them. The jungle that had once seemed so full of promise and adventure now felt like a living nightmare, a place where something ancient and deadly had been hiding, waiting for them. Her mind drifted back to Emily, her friend, her mentor, the woman who had been the heart of their expedition. Emily had always been the one to push forward, the one to see beyond the immediate dangers to the greater purpose. It had been her drive that had led them deeper into the jungle, her determination to uncover the truth that had kept them moving. And now she was gone. Clara felt a deep ache in her chest, a sense of loss that was almost too much to bear. Emily had sacrificed everything to stop the parasite, to save them. But even in death, she had left Clara with a heavy burden of responsibility to carry on, to ensure that the organism didn't escape, that the truth of what had happened here was told. "I'll make sure it wasn't for nothing," Clara whispered to the empty jungle, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "I'll make sure the world knows." The journey out of the jungle was grueling. The team moved quickly, driven by a mixture of fear and desperation, but the dense foliage, the oppressive heat, and the constant threat of danger slowed their progress. Every sound in the jungle, every rustle of leaves, every distant animal call set their nerves on edge, making them jumpy and paranoid. Clara led the group, her mind constantly racing with thoughts of what might be waiting for them ahead. She knew they were on borrowed time. The longer they stayed in the jungle, the greater the chance that the parasite could re-emerge, that another infection could occur. They had to reach civilization before that happened. As they pressed on, Clara couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was watching them. The jungle, once so vibrant and full of life, now felt like a malevolent presence, as though the organism itself had left its mark on the land. She kept her senses alert, scanning the trees for any sign of danger, but everything seemed normal. The hours stretched on, and exhaustion began to take its toll. Javier stumbled at one point, collapsing to the ground in a heap. Dr. Morales rushed to his side, helping him back to his feet, but the intern's face was pale, his breathing shallow. I can't keep going," Javier panted, his voice weak. "I feel sick." Clara's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was the parasite already inside him, slowly taking hold? She knelt beside Javier, her eyes searching his face for any sign of infection. His skin was clammy, his pulse rapid, but there was no sign of aggression, no indication that he was losing control. "It could just be dehydration," Dr. Morales said, trying to calm Clara's fears. "We've been pushing hard, and the heat is getting to all of us." Clara nodded, though her concern lingered. "They couldn't afford to take any chances. Let's keep an eye on him. If his condition gets worse, we'll have to stop and assess." Javier nodded weakly, his eyes filled with fear. Clara could tell he was thinking the same thing she was, that the parasite might be inside him, waiting to take over. But for now, they had to keep moving. As night fell, the group made camp in a small clearing, exhausted from the day's journey. Clara sat by the fire, her mind too restless to sleep. She stared into the flames, her thoughts consumed by everything that had happened. Emily's sacrifice, the uncertainty of the parasite's spread, the looming fear that any one of them could still be infected. "Are we going to make it out of here?" Javier asked quietly, sitting beside her. His voice was laced with doubt, his hands trembling slightly. Clara hesitated, not sure how to answer. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him that they would make it, that they would find a way. But the truth was, she didn't know. The jungle had already taken so much from them, and the future was uncertain. "We have to try," Clara said finally, her voice soft but determined. "We owe it to Emily to survive. We owe it to her to tell the world what we found here." Javier nodded, his eyes downcast. "I just don't want to die like that. I don't want to become one of them." Clara swallowed hard, her own fears mirroring his. We'll make it out of here, I promise." The next morning, they pressed on. By now, the jungle felt like it was closing in on them, its dense foliage and oppressive humidity sapping their strength. Clara's thoughts drifted to the outside world, to what would happen if they failed. The parasite, this ancient, intelligent organism, couldn't be allowed to spread. If it reached civilization, the consequences would be catastrophic. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the jungle into a clearing. In the distance, the faint outlines of a village could be seen, nestled near the river. Relief washed over the group. They had made it. But Clara knew this was only the beginning. As they approached the village, Clara felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over her. She had to ensure that the truth of what had happened in the jungle was told, that the parasite, the organism, never escaped into the world. But as they crossed into the village, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The jungle, the organism, had left its mark on all of them, and the fear that it could still be inside them lingered like a shadow. The village was a humble collection of huts, surrounded by dense jungle and a winding river. It was a stark contrast to the isolation and horror Clara and the others had just endured. The simple sight of human life, people going about their daily routines, offered a fragile sense of relief, but Clara knew they couldn't let their guard down yet. The organism might still be with them. As they approached the village, the locals watched the group with curious eyes. Children paused their games, and elders leaned in to whisper. To the villagers, Clara and her team were strangers, tired, dirty, and visibly shaken, but they didn't yet know the true danger the group might be carrying with them. Clara's mind raced as they neared the center of the village. She had to find a way to contact the outside world, to warn authorities of the parasite and ensure the world understood the threat. But the problem was immediate. What if one of them was already infected? The villagers greeted them cautiously, sensing their distress. An elderly man, the village leader, approached Clara and Dr. Morales. He was tall and stooped with age, his face weathered and wise. He spoke in Spanish, asking if they needed help, if they were lost. Dr. Morales answered, explaining their situation in the simplest terms. He spoke of their expedition, the hardships they had faced, and how they had lost most of their team. He didn't mention the parasite, not yet. They didn't want to cause panic, especially since they had no way of proving anyone was still infected. The village leader offered them food, shelter, and a chance to rest. He directed them to a small hut near the outskirts, a temporary refuge while they figured out their next move. Clara hesitated. She couldn't shake the sense of dread gnawing at her. While part of her longed for rest, for safety, she knew the organism was still a threat. If even one of them was still infected, they could bring disaster to this village. Later that night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat in a corner of the hut, staring out at the moonlit jungle, her mind filled with thoughts of Emily's sacrifice and the terrible secret they now carried. The fire in the center of the hut flickered softly, casting shadows across the faces of her team. Dr. Morales was snoring softly, while Javier lay curled up, restless and feverish. Clara's gaze lingered on Javier. His condition had worsened throughout the day. He hadn't said much, but Clara could tell he was suffering. His skin had grown pale, his movements sluggish, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that sent chills down her spine. She knew the signs, she had seen it before. Fear twisted in her gut as she considered the possibility, the horrible, inescapable reality, that Javier might be infected. If the parasite had taken root inside him, they had very little time. It wouldn't be long before he became a danger to them all. Clara knelt beside him, placing a hand on his forehead. His skin was clammy, his breathing shallow. Javier stirred under her touch, his eyes fluttering open. He looked up at her, his voice weak. "I feel strange," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "Something's wrong, Clara. I think it's inside me." Clara's heart clenched, but she kept her expression calm, her voice steady. "We're going to help you, Javier. Just hold on." But inside, she knew there was no cure. There was no way to save him. Javier's condition deteriorated quickly. By the following morning, it was clear that the parasite had taken hold. He became erratic, lashing out in confusion and fear, his behavior mirroring Emily's transformation in the jungle. Clara watched helplessly as the parasite's influence grew stronger, twisting Javier's mind, consuming him from within. The village had noticed. Whispers spread through the community, and the villagers began to keep their distance, sensing that something was horribly wrong. The village leader approached Clara, his expression stern and concerned. He demanded answers. What was happening to Javier? Was this some kind of disease they had brought with them? Clara knew she couldn't hide the truth any longer. She gathered the remaining members of her team and the village elders in the central hut, her heart heavy as she prepared to reveal the full extent of the danger they faced. As Clara explained the parasite, a heavy silence fell over the room. The village elders listened in horror as she recounted their encounter with the organism, how it had infected Santiago, Emily, and now likely Javier. She told them about the deaths, the terrifying symptoms of the parasite, and how it fed on fear, spreading its influence like a virus. "We thought we destroyed it," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly. "Emily, she gave her life to stop it, but I think Javier has been infected. And if the parasite spreads to anyone else, it will be unstoppable. The elders exchanged fearful glances, and the village leader stood, his face set in grim determination. "If what you say is true," he said slowly, "then we cannot allow it to spread. We must take action." Clara knew what he meant. Javier was beyond saving, and if they didn't stop the parasite now, the entire village could be lost. But the thought of condemning Javier, of letting him die, tore at her soul. "We'll have to isolate him," Dr. Morales suggested, his voice somber. "Quarantine him outside the village until we're sure." The village leader nodded, but Clara could see the fear in his eyes. He knew as well as she did that quarantine wouldn't be enough. If the parasite continued to grow within Javier, it would only be a matter of time before the organism broke free. As night fell, Clara made the hardest decision of her life. Javier was too dangerous to let live. The parasite had already consumed him, twisting his mind and body into something unrecognizable. His once friendly demeanor had been replaced by violent outbursts and a chilling, cold gaze that reminded Clara of Emily in her final moments. She couldn't let it spread. She couldn't let Javier become the vessel that unleashed the organism into the world. With the village leader's reluctant blessing, Clara and Dr. Morales took Javier out into the jungle, far from the village. Javier was weak and delirious, barely able to walk, but Clara could see the parasite's influence growing stronger with each passing minute. His body was changing, becoming something monstrous. They stopped at a clearing, the jungle quiet around them. The moonlight bathed the trees in an eerie glow, and Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Javier turned to her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know what you have to do." Clara's heart broke. Tears filled her eyes as she raised the gun they had brought with them, a single bullet, meant to end it before the parasite could spread. Javier closed his eyes, accepting his fate, and Clara pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the jungle, and for a brief moment, everything was still. Clara stood frozen, her mind numb with grief. Javier's body lay motionless on the jungle floor, and the parasite's threat was finally over. But the cost had been unbearable. She had lost nearly everyone, her friends, her colleagues, and now Javier, too, was gone. Dr. Morales placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support, but there was nothing he could say to ease the pain. Clara had done what had to be done, but the weight of her decisions would haunt her for the rest of her life. They buried Javier in the clearing, marking the grave with a simple stone. Clara stood over the grave for a long time, her thoughts consumed by everything they had lost. Emily's words echoed in her mind, "Tell them what we found here. Make sure it never happens again." The next morning, Clara and the team left the village. They had contacted authorities the night before, sending word of the parasite and the need for a quarantine around the area. The jungle was too dangerous, the organism too unpredictable. No one could be allowed to venture into the heart of it again. As they boarded a small boat that would take them downriver, Clara looked back at the jungle one last time. It was quiet now, the dense trees swaying gently in the breeze. But Clara knew the organism was still out there, lurking, waiting for another chance to strike. She had survived, but the jungle had left its mark on her. The weight of the truth she carried, the secret of the parasite, would be with her forever. And as the boat drifted away, Clara silently vowed that she would do whatever it took to make sure the world never forgot what they had found in the Amazon. The boat cut through the murky water of the Amazon River, its engine humming steadily as it carried Clara, Dr. Morales, and the remaining survivors away from the village and the jungle that had been their nightmare. The early morning fog clung to the surface of the river, adding an eerie stillness to the air. For the first time in days, Clara felt a tentative sense of relief. The jungle was behind them, but the weight of what they had endured still pressed heavily on her. The journey downriver was quiet. Clara spent most of the time gazing out over the river, lost in thought. The sights and sounds of the jungle had been replaced by the steady rhythm of the boat, the gentle lap of water against the hull. Dr. Morales and the survivors sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on the events that had transpired. As they traveled, Clara felt a gnawing unease. The parasite was gone from their immediate surroundings, but the dread of what might still be lurking, what they might have missed, refused to leave her. Javier's death had been a grim reminder of the parasite's power, and the fear that it could still be a threat was ever present. Around midday, As the boat approached a larger settlement, the mood shifted. Clara's heart raced as she saw the signs of civilization, a small town with buildings and roads, people moving about in their daily routines. It was a relief to see other people, but the nagging thought of the parasite's possible spread still lingered. Dr. Morales had arranged for their arrival to be discreet, reaching out to authorities in advance. As the boat docked, they were met by a team of scientists and health officials who had been briefed on the situation. Clara stepped off the boat, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and anxiety. The world outside the jungle was about to learn about the parasite, and she had to make sure they understood the gravity of the situation. The health officials led them to a secure facility on the outskirts of town. It was a modern building, equipped with the latest technology and containment protocols. Clara was relieved to see the level of preparedness. It was clear that they took the threat seriously. Inside the facility, the group was debriefed extensively. Clara and Dr. Morales provided a detailed account of their expedition, the discovery of the parasite, its effects, and the events that had led to their harrowing escape. They spoke of the symptoms, the aggressive nature of the parasite, and the tragic loss of their team members. The scientists listened intently, taking notes and asking probing questions. They were particularly interested in the biological aspects of the parasite, its life cycle, and its potential for spreading. Clara could see the concern in their eyes as they realized the implications of what she was describing. As the day progressed, Clara's sense of unease grew. The facility was buzzing with activity as researchers and officials discussed the next steps. There were discussions about quarantining the affected areas of the jungle, conducting further research, and formulating plans to ensure that the parasite did not escape. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had seen firsthand the parasite's ability to manipulate and control, and she feared that there might still be more to the story, something they had missed, or something that had escaped their notice. In the evening, Clara and Dr. Morales were given a brief respite. They were provided with accommodations and allowed to rest. Clara sat in her room, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had hoped that the authorities would take swift action, but the slow pace of bureaucracy and the sheer scale of the situation made her anxious. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. Morales entered, his face drawn and tired. "Clara, we need to talk," he said quietly. They met in the common area of the facility, away from prying eyes. Dr. Morales looked around to ensure they were alone before speaking. "Clara, I've been thinking, what if the parasite wasn't just confined to the jungle? What if it has a way to spread beyond that area?" Clara frowned, her heart sinking. "What do you mean? We've seen how it manipulates fear, how it spreads. If it's capable of influencing individuals, could it be possible that some part of it could have hitchhiked on us? What if it's not just in the jungle, but within our own borders?" The thought struck Clara like a cold wave. She had been so focused on the immediate threat in the jungle that she hadn't considered the possibility of an unseen enemy spreading through them. "We need to inform the authorities immediately," Clara said, her voice urgent. "If there's any chance the parasite could be elsewhere, we have to act fast." Dr. Morales nodded, his expression grim. "I agree. We should push for immediate action, more rigorous testing, increased security, and communication with international health organizations." Clara and Dr. Morales returned to the research facility. They met with the lead scientist, Dr. Sofia Ramirez, who had been overseeing their debriefing. Clara and Dr. Morales presented their concerns about the potential for the parasite to spread beyond the jungle, emphasizing the need for increased vigilance and precaution. Dr. Ramirez listened carefully, her expression serious. "We're already taking measures to contain the threat, but I'll escalate this issue. We'll implement stricter protocols and ensure that everyone involved is aware of the potential risk." As the night deepened, Clara felt a small measure of relief. The authorities had taken their concerns seriously and promised to increase their efforts to contain and study the parasite. But Clara knew that the real test would be in the days and weeks to come. If the parasite had indeed managed to spread, the world would be facing a much larger crisis. Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling once more, her thoughts swirling with the enormity of their discovery. She had hoped to escape the jungle's horrors, but it seemed that the true battle was only just beginning. The next morning, Clara was awoken by a phone call. It was Dr. Ramirez, her voice tense. "Clara, we've got a situation." There's been a breach in one of the containment areas. We need you and Dr. Morales to come immediately." Clara's heart raced as she and Dr. Morales hurried to the facility. The thought of another outbreak of the parasite escaping its containment was almost too much to bear. They had already lost so much, they couldn't afford to lose more. As they arrived at the containment area, Clara could see the urgency in the scientists' faces. There was chaos, with people moving quickly and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Dr. Ramirez approached them, her expression grave. "There's been a breach. We're trying to assess the situation, but we need your help. We have to ensure that the parasite hasn't escaped." Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. "We'll do whatever it takes." The breach was contained, but the incident served as a stark reminder of the parasite's potential to spread. As the scientists worked to stabilize the situation, Clara and Dr. Morales stayed on high alert, knowing that the real challenge was only beginning. Clara glanced at the containment area, the gravity of their situation settling in. The jungle had left its mark on them, and now the world was facing a threat that demanded their utmost vigilance. The parasite was an unseen enemy, but Clara was determined to fight it with everything she had. She had survived the jungle, faced unimaginable horrors, and now she would do whatever it took to ensure that the world was prepared for the dangers that lay ahead. The aftermath of the containment breach left the research facility on edge. The staff worked tirelessly to ensure that no further breaches occurred and that all protocols were strictly followed. The incident had heightened security measures, and there was a palpable sense of urgency in the air. Clara and Dr. Morales, though exhausted, knew they had to stay vigilant. The parasite's potential to escape was a constant threat. Clara found herself deep in thought, revisiting their expedition's key moments. The discovery, the horror, the loss, it all played back in her mind like a relentless loop. The parasite was more than just a biological threat. It had become a dark part of her reality, and she struggled to reconcile with its presence. During a meeting with Dr. Ramirez and other key personnel, Clara brought up the idea of researching the origins of the parasite. "We need to understand where it came from, how it evolved. Knowing more about its origins could help us find a way to combat it more effectively." Dr. Ramirez agreed. "We have samples from the jungle, and we're analyzing them, but we could use any insights you might have, anything that could provide context." As Clara and Dr. Morales delved into the parasite's origins, they discovered that some of the collected samples had been contaminated. The research team suspected that the breach might have compromised their data. This realization added to their anxiety. Not only were they racing against time to contain the threat, but they were also facing setbacks in their research. Clara decided to revisit the village. She believed that the local folklore might hold clues about the parasite's origins. The villagers had spoken of a spirit of the jungle, a malevolent force that thrived on fear and destruction. Clara and Dr. Morales returned to the village, hoping to uncover more information. The villagers were wary but willing to help. The village leader, who had been instrumental in their previous interactions, welcomed them. He took Clara and Dr. Morales to an elder, a woman known for her knowledge of local legends and myths. The elder, an imposing figure with a deep, knowing gaze, sat them down in her modest hut. "The jungle is alive with spirits and ancient forces," she began. "The one you encountered is not of our world. It is a spirit that feeds on fear and despair, and it was imprisoned long ago by our ancestors." Clara listened intently as the elder spoke of an ancient ritual that had been used to contain the spirit. The ritual involved powerful symbols and artifacts, which were believed to have bound the spirit to the jungle. Over time, the details of the ritual had faded, and the spirit's presence had been mostly forgotten. "This spirit was once feared," the elder continued, "but the jungle has grown wild, and the spirit's power has grown with it. It can influence the minds of those who enter its domain, driving them to madness and despair." Clara and Dr. Morales left the village with new insights. The information about the ancient ritual gave them a new lead. If the parasite was indeed a spirit bound by an ancient ritual, finding remnants of that ritual or artifacts related to it might provide a way to understand and potentially control or eradicate the parasite. Back at the research facility, Clara and Dr. Morales relayed their findings to Dr. Ramirez. The ancient ritual's details seemed to offer a new direction for their research. They began to focus on finding artifacts or symbols associated with the ritual, hoping they might provide clues to combating the parasite. Days turned into weeks as the team worked tirelessly. The facility was abuzz with activity as they investigated every lead related to the ancient ritual. Clara spent long hours poring over old texts and collaborating with local experts on folklore and ancient rituals. The sense of urgency was palpable. The parasite's potential to spread remained a constant threat. During one of these research sessions, Clara stumbled upon an old journal in the facility's archives. The journal belonged to a researcher who had previously studied the region's folklore and myths. It contained detailed descriptions of the ritual and sketches of symbols that might have been used to bind the spirit. The journal mentioned a heart of the jungle, an artifact believed to be the key to the ritual's power. According to the text, this artifact was hidden deep within the jungle, and it was crucial to finding it in order to understand the ritual's full extent. Clara and Dr. Morales decided to return to the jungle. Despite the risks, they knew they had to search for the heart of the jungle. It was a gamble, but it was their best chance to uncover more about the parasite and potentially find a way to control or destroy it. With the facility's support, they prepared for the journey, gathering supplies and ensuring they had the necessary precautions in place. As they ventured back into the jungle, the weight of their mission hung heavily over them. The parasite's influence was still a real threat, and they had to be prepared for anything. The journey through the jungle was arduous and fraught with danger. The dense foliage, oppressive humidity, and constant threat of wildlife made progress slow and challenging. Clara and Dr. Morales pressed on, driven by the hope that the heart of the jungle might hold the answers they needed. As they navigated through the jungle, Clara reflected on the village elder's words about the spirit's influence and the ancient ritual. She hoped that finding the artifact would provide the key to understanding and ultimately defeating the parasite. But the jungle was unpredictable, and as they delved deeper, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sense of being observed, the eerie silence that sometimes fell over the jungle, it all added to the growing sense of dread. One evening, while setting up camp, Clara and Dr. Morales noticed something unsettling. Strange markings appeared on the trees around their campsite symbols that matched those described in the journal. The realization that they might be getting closer to the heart of the jungle both excited and terrified them. As night fell, Clara's dreams were haunted by visions of the parasite and the spirit it represented. She woke in a cold sweat, feeling the oppressive weight of fear. The jungle seemed to close in around them, and Clara knew that whatever they were searching for was within reach. The next morning, the jungle revealed its secrets. After hours of searching, Clara and Dr. Morales stumbled upon an ancient structure partially hidden by the jungle. It was a crumbling ruin, covered in vines and moss, but the symbols on the walls matched those in the journal. As they explored the ruin, they found a hidden chamber. Inside was an ornate pedestal, upon which rested a small, intricately carved box. The heart of the jungle was within reach. Clara's heart raced as she carefully opened the box, revealing a series of ancient artifact symbols, carvings, and what appeared to be a ceremonial dagger. The artifacts seemed to resonate with a strange energy, and Clara could sense that they were connected to the ritual that had bound the spirit. As Clara and Dr. Morales prepared to return to the facility, they felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. The heart of the jungle and the associated artifacts offered new hope, but the dangers of the jungle and the looming threat of the parasite remained ever present. With the artifacts in their possession, Clara and Dr. Morales made their way back to the research facility. The journey was tense, and every rustle of the jungle seemed to amplify their fears. They were determined to uncover the full extent of the ancient ritual and find a way to control or destroy the parasite once and for all. The weeks following Clara and Dr. Morales' return to the research facility were intense. The artifacts from the heart of the jungle were carefully studied, and a team of experts worked around the clock to decode the symbols and understand their significance. Clara, though physically and emotionally exhausted, remained deeply involved in the research, driven by the urgency of their mission. The parasite, now contained and under close surveillance, had not shown signs of escaping beyond the facility's secure perimeter. The knowledge gained from the ancient artifacts provided new insights into the parasite's nature and its containment. The researchers developed a containment strategy based on the ancient ritual's principles, a hopeful but untested measure to prevent future outbreaks. One evening, as Clara walked through the facility's garden, she took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. The tranquility of the garden, with its carefully tended plants and the soft hum of evening insects, was a stark contrast to the chaos of the jungle. It was a rare moment of peace that Clara savored. Dr. Morales joined her, his face showing a weary but determined expression. "We've made progress," he said quietly. "The new containment measures are based on the ritual's principles. It's not a cure, but it's a step forward." Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I hope it's enough. We've come so far, but there's still so much to learn." Dr. Morales joined her, his face showing a weary but determined expression. "We've made progress," he said quietly. "The new containment measures are based on the ritual's principles. It's not a cure, but it's a step forward." Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I hope it's enough. We've come so far, but there's still so much to learn." As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Clara felt a fragile sense of hope. The parasite had been contained, and while the threat was not fully eradicated, the world was better prepared than before. The knowledge and artifacts from the jungle had given them a chance to understand and manage the threat, but Clara knew that the journey was far from over. The jungle had left its mark on her, a reminder of the delicate balance between humanity and the unknown. The world was still vulnerable, and the echoes of their encounter with the parasite would continue to resonate in their minds. In the quiet of the evening, Clara vowed to continue her work, to ensure that the world remained vigilant and prepared. The struggle against the unseen enemy had taught her the importance of understanding and respect for the unknown. The jungle had revealed its secrets, but it had also shown her the strength of human resolve and the power of hope. As the stars appeared in the night sky, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been arduous, but it had also forged a path toward a future where knowledge and vigilance might keep the shadows at bay.